Hi, everyone. Welcome to the University of Toronto Joint Center for Bioethics Seminar Series. I'm Angel Petropanagos, and I'll be the moderator for today's session. Our speaker today is Sophia Fantus, and her seminar is entitled Researching Surrogacy, the Ethics of Research Approaches to Gay Fatherhood. Before I introduce today's speaker, I'd like to let you know that the seminar is being recorded, and this lecture, along with other archived lectures, can be accessed through the Joint Center for Bioethics website. The format of our seminar today is a presentation by our speaker, followed by a facilitated discussion period. Now, before we begin, we wish to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Dr. Sophia Fantus received her PhD from the University of Toronto in social work and bioethics. Her dissertation explored gestational surrogacy among gay men in Canada. Through qualitative interviews, Dr. Fantus looked at motivations to pursue surrogacy, the interpersonal relationships between surrogates and intended parents, and institutional supports and barriers. After her PhD, she completed a postdoctoral fellowship in clinical ethics at Baylor College of Medicine, in conjunction with Weill Cornell Medicine. She is currently a tenure-track assistant professor at the University of Texas at Arlington School of Social Work. Her various projects include looking at the implications of the COVID-19 pandemic among LGBTQIA+ college students in Texas, and understanding experiences of moral distress among healthcare social workers and chaplains across the state of Texas. Sophia, welcome. It's great to see you. And over to you. I'm looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much, Angel. And thank you so much, everybody, for being here today. That was a great introduction, so I don't need to say much else, but on top of being an assistant professor, I am also a new mother, and my baby is homesick today. And so if I have to cut things short or I have to leave for a quick minute, I am so sorry in advance. He is sleeping now, so hopefully he will sleep throughout this presentation to the soothing sound of my voice. But today's presentation is called Researching Surrogacy, the Ethics of Research Approaches to Gay Fatherhood. And really, this is kind of a conceptual framework understanding that really stemmed from my dissertation work. Obviously, my research trajectory, as Angel had said, has shifted a little bit, but these are thoughts that I've had as not only through my research was published and shared, but as I've witnessed worldwide more research being conducted among gay fathers, and especially gay fathers pursuing surrogacy. So a little bit for those who may not have this background, there's a growing visibility of same-sex parent families, right? And this is true across the globe. I'm in Texas right now, so in the United States, but also in Canada, and we can see in countries worldwide. And it's through the use of assisted reproduction and primarily surrogacy. So we're seeing a rise of gay fathers really pursuing surrogacy and gestational surrogacy to have their own biological children. And what this has done is this really broadened family scholarship and family studies. And so it's not only something that we've witnessed, in our day-to-day interactions or going to daycare or seeing those in the park, but it's also through how we study and what we're studying. And I think with that, we really need to start looking at the ways in which we navigate research and research designs. And so one of the things that I've noticed in terms of my own research, but also in research moving forward, is this notion of planned gay parenthood. So research, not way back in the day, but decades ago, was really interested in gay men who had children in heterosexual relationships. So they were previously married to a woman, they had a child, and then they would come out as gay. And then it would be looking at those experiences. So the coming out experiences, disclosing to children, navigating that transition to fatherhood. But as we started to see adoption being used, co-parenting, surrogacy, there was more and more interest in planned gay parenthood. So those gay men who work together to navigate having a family. And so there's been worldwide interest. We've seen studies coming out of Israel, out of Asia, Australia, New Zealand, of gay fatherhood and what this means. And most of the research has looked at either the transitions to fatherhood or what I really want to focus on a little bit and why this conceptual framework kind of started building in my brain is this no difference research and heteronormativity. So a lot of the research that focused on gay fatherhood would really start looking at their children's well-being and development. And how they would navigate that was to compare the children of gay fathers to heterosexual or different gendered parents. And what that would mean was they would build these comparisons and contrasts between families. And as I started to look at this and navigate this, what really came up for me was how these research designs were built and structured within heteronormative frameworks and approaches to what we mean by family, to what we mean by biological kinship, what we mean by pregnancy in the body and having a child, and how these approaches would sort of be navigated by showing that children didn't show any differences than children of heterosexual parents or different gendered parents. And the issue here is not necessarily the research, but one, how the research is designed and that, focus in terms of what we mean by family, what we mean by kinship, but also this idea of navigating this norm. If we're comparing and saying, oh, children who have same-sex parents show no differences than children of heterosexual parents, what we're ultimately saying is that heterosexual parents are the norm. Heterosexual parents are that comparison normative framework or family structure that we want to look at. And so that's what started this approach for me and this thinking of how do we look at research differently? How do we start designing research differently? We know that there's no differences. And in some research, it's even shown that children do better in same-sex parent households. And so let's move past that. Where can we go now? And so what I really want to kind of talk about is an inclusive model for family-centered research, where we consider the diverse socio-historical and political contexts, and we really look at the perspectives, attitudes, and values of gay men. Because if we focus on those comparisons, if we focus on that no difference research, what we're doing is we're losing those nuanced perspectives, those nuanced experiences of gay fathers, because we're really just interested in those correlations, right? Or those numbers and what they're showing in terms of those contrasts or comparisons. And then what we lose sight of also is the resilience of gay fatherhood and the resilience of gay fathers who navigate these structures and these family structures within heteronormative and homonegative systems. And I'll talk a little bit about that too, but that's something that I thought we should think about as well. And so my sort of idea, my conceptual framework is really to build upon family theory model to understand gay men's procreative identities. I'm not going to go into really the specifics of the family theory model specifically on procreative identity that William Marsiglio created. But that was really sort of filtered in on heterosexual parenthood and the aspect of your partner being the one to carry and deliver a biologically related child. So what I wanted this new family theory model to look at is really to address the increased scholarship on surrogacy. So looking at a family theory model that really understands not only gay men's procreative identities, but their procreative identities in relation to surrogacy. And why I wanted to be so specific is one, because for those of you who joined, perhaps many of you are familiar with surrogacy or know a lot about surrogacy, so I'm not going to go into those intricacies, but it's just so different than going through adoption, than using other assisted reproductive means, or even doing co-parenting. And so really to kind of build a model that really centers on the uniqueness of surrogacy is really, really important. I wanted to identify those nuanced experiences in reproductive decision-making, and I wanted to dismantle the medical diagnosis of infertility. So often family theory models will not only talk about infertility as a medical diagnosis that needs treatment and intervention, but then that diagnosis of infertility is then brought in to talk about things like grief and loss and life crisis approaches. So anytime surrogacy or assisted reproduction is mentioned among different gendered or heterosexual parent families, it's often framed in this grief, loss, marital dissatisfaction, years of infertility and experiences, and surrogacy being this last resort, right? But for gay men, surrogacy is actually this life-affirming technology that has really led to their ability to have a family. And so it's not necessarily that last resort, it's a first resort. It's this new incredible opportunity to have children. And so to reframe those experiences of grief and loss for excitement and adventure and possibility is really, really crucial to our understanding. And so when we think about gay men's procreative identities, these are the three main concepts that Marsiglio created. And I'm going to go through each one and talk about how they're framed in terms of gay men's procreative identities through surrogacy. So the first is procreative consciousness. The second is procreative responsibility. And actually the third is a brand new term that I am coining that Marsiglio never talked about and that I have not seen in research. And I'm calling it procreative transitioning. And I'm going to explain what that means, but I think it's very different than those post-birth experiences that we often hear talked about in terms of surrogacy. And I'm going to get to that towards the end. So I want us to understand consciousness, responsibility, and then I'm going to talk about my new term of transitioning and why that's so, specific and unique to gay parenthood. So procreative consciousness, what is that? So procreative consciousness is exactly kind of what it sounds like. It is the decision of whether or not to have children and men's attitudes, feelings, and thoughts about reproduction and having children. And for gay men, I think it's wrapped in three different concepts that we have to understand: individual life events, romantic interpersonal relationships, and socio-historical contexts. And what I will say is the way in which I frame this is really through my own research, as well as looking at research and reviewing research that has come from around the world. Because a lot of the research, even conducted in Australia, even conducted in the UK, conducted in Israel, is kind of showing those same themes come up again and again and again. So this is where I'm kind of grounding a lot of these conclusions and findings based on that data. So what do I mean by individual life events? So gay men have talked about that paternal instinct since childhood, right? Always wanting to be a father, always remembering that they wanted to be a father, not having this idea or something happening. It's this just paternal instinct that they've always had. Some have grown up in a big family, have had nieces and nephews, have taken care of other children, and have always wanted children through that way. But then something really unique, because we've heard that among heterosexual men too, but something really unique as well are individual demographics. So things like high socioeconomic status, health literacy, education, high education, stable employment, and living in an urban area, especially LGBT-friendly areas. Now, these are kind of the obvious, right, when we think about surrogacy and how expensive surrogacy is, especially in other countries. High socioeconomic status makes a lot of sense, and also health literacy. But LGBT-friendly neighborhoods creates that access to resources, to supports, to inclusive fertility clinics, to inclusive health systems that really create those opportunities, because they have to become aware that these things exist. They have to become aware that this is a possibility, something that they may not have grown up with before. And so all these kind of individual demographics really play an important role in deciding whether or not to have children, because as many gay men say, many of them, not the ones who had the paternal instinct, but many of them say, well, I never thought I could have a child. I never thought this was a possibility. And then I learned about surrogacy. I learned about these options. And so this is why demographics is so important. In terms of romantic interpersonal relationships, so connecting that thing that I just said of never thought they could be a father, there were a lot of gay fathers in all the studies that, I've looked at in my studies as well, of incongruent gay father identities, having that incongruency of saying, I can never be gay and be a father. And this not only stemmed from their internalized thinking, but it also stemmed from talking to families, their own relatives, colleagues, friends, who kind of affirmed that, right? Who would go through processes of grief. We hear a lot about non-affirming parents who would grieve not being able to have a grandchild, right? And so they would hear these stories growing up, especially after coming out to their parents, and kind of just believe that they couldn't be fathers. And it took a partner to show them that they could, and a partner who desired to parent. So many gay fathers talk about this idea of, I never thought it was possible until I met my partner and they introduced me to this possibility. They wanted to be a parent so badly. They're the one who had that paternal instinct. And so many of them talked about this long-standing, stable, monogamous partnership or relationship that they had that then instilled them to have a child. So for many of them, they were in a long-standing, stable, monogamous partnership and said, we were together, then we decided that we wanted to get married or have a civil union, and then we decided to have a child. So they have that very sort of similar traditional route that we've seen. And some of the ways that we can think about this are protective mechanisms. So that fears of stigma and discrimination, where if they could show, well, no, I'm in a long-standing, stable, monogamous relationship, we're married, and then we intentionally thought of having a child, help them to alleviate or lessen that anticipated stigma that they would face from non-affirming parents and relatives, colleagues, and especially just public strangers and public attitudes around LGBTQ plus parenthood. And I'll get into that a little bit afterwards, but those romantic interpersonal relationships really fueled not only the desire to have a child, but say it's okay to have a child. And the last is sociohistorical context. So sociohistorical context, I want to sort of divide them, because I think what we tend to concentrate on are, well, there's so many more legal rights for LGBT parenthood, so many more affirming positive public attitudes surrounding LGBT parents. We see it in social media. We're now seeing it on television, and it's becoming more and more visible. And oftentimes that's true, right? And so that visibility creates this sort of social exposure and this idea of saying it's okay and it's contingent on legislation. Well, I'm legally allowed to do this, so I'm going to go forward and do it because I see it around me and it's accessible and attainable. But what we tend to do when we concentrate on that is lose sight of the history of anti-LGBT legislation and knowing that there's still barriers in fertility and parenting supports. Parenting supports are primarily for different gendered parents, right? Especially mom groups, right? And mommy and baby groups around womanhood. There's limited resources and services, which I'll get into a little bit more in procreative transitioning. There's homonegative discourses and images. And because of the history of anti-LGBT legislation, a lot of gay fathers have talked about that fear of children being taken away. And so surrogacy, for even just the littlest bit amount, takes away some of that fear, takes away some of that caution, saying my children aren't going to be taken away from me, but because I did this through surrogacy, because they are biologically related to me, maybe they won't be taken away from me. So even though legal legislation has changed in many parts of the world, and LGBT parents are granted more and more opportunities in many parts of the world, not all, the history of anti-LGBT legislation, the history of anti-LGBT attitudes still create fears of going forward and moving forward, especially through adoption and co-parenting, of those fears of those children being taken away or harmed in certain ways. So what I want you to take away from procreative consciousness is the intentional, thoughtful, and meaningful identity integration and the courage to disrupt systemic heteronormative context, which is very different than the decision of whether or not to have children for different gendered parents. And so now we move to procreative responsibility. And procreative responsibility is a bit different than consciousness, where it's beliefs, attitudes, preferences, and behaviors related to one's expectations and involvement in childbearing and childcare activities. So it's not the decision of whether or not to have children, it's how to be involved and those expectations of involvement. And there's two sort of interrelated ideas of procreative responsibility, which I'm going to kind of dissect, which is the decision to pursue surrogacy in and of itself. So it's not even the decision of whether or not to have children, but the decision to pursue surrogacy in and of itself. And then through surrogacy, how gay fathers visualize their social fatherhood, right? That role of becoming fathers when it's not their partner who is visibly pregnant, right? Or going through that. And so what's really interesting in terms of the deciding to pursue surrogacy is that many gay fathers saw surrogacy as guaranteed. And I know this sounds sort of almost unbelievable to those who have done surrogacy research, right? How can we think surrogacy is guaranteed, right? There are so many things that can go wrong in a surrogacy arrangement. But for gay fathers, one of the things about surrogacy that made it more of a guarantee is the uncertainty of adoption. So many adoption agencies, especially in the United States, my study was conducted in Canada, but now living in the United States and reading a lot of US-based research, is that a lot of adoption agencies are through faith-based organizations. And those organizations are legally allowed to discriminate against LGBT parents. So the uncertainty of adoption, of either going through private adoption, which can take years and cost a lot of money, or going through other adoptions, but being told they're not allowed to adopt, surrogacy was often viewed as more of a guarantee of something they could control more than the adoption process. And with the adoption process, there were limited LGBT affirming policies and practices. And there was also this idea of raising a child from birth. So a lot of gay fathers talked about the idea of not wanting an older kid, not wanting, somebody that didn't have a physical likeness, that raising them from birth, knowing them the day they were born, right? And we can see those legitimate ties to kinship, to blood ties, those types of things that we've read about in family structures and family systems. It also created this idea of not only being more guaranteed, but that physical likeness, that idea of family, really anticipating stigma in the schoolyard for their children and saying, they won't be taken away from me. There's going to be more legitimacy because they are related to at least one of us. So that might alleviate or mitigate some of that stigma that my children are going to face in the schoolyard for having two men as parents or same-sex parents. And then deciding to pursue surrogacy is also the legal climate, right? So across the globe, there are restrictions on surrogacy for LGBTQIA+ parents. For example, Israel just changed their law, but there is like a year where there can be some counter arguments to the changed law. And so there's a lot of not knowing what's going to happen in terms of that. And there's other countries as well, like some states in Australia, some places in New Zealand that don't allow LGBTQ+ parents to access surrogacy. So when you think about surrogacy, gay fathers often have to think about where they live. So the LGBT rights, parenting rights, where they are, the surrogacy laws where they are, but then also where they plan to pursue surrogacy. And that, I think, is why we see so much cross-border surrogacy as well as surrogacy in Canada. I know that in Canada, we are witnessing I don't want to say so many, but a lot of same-sex parents and intended parents coming to Canada. And now there's this big discussion about what we do about cross-border surrogacy. Some of my argument, and not here, and I don't mean like an argument in a defensive way, but I think a lot of that stems from their native countries and anti-LGBT discrimination there because they are not allowed to pursue it in their own country. And so they come to Canada. And when I spoke to some of the gay fathers in my study, I spoke to some, I studied purely domestic surrogacy. So where they were in Canada and they used a Canadian surrogate, but I talked to some who were not eligible for my study about who were international saying, I want to come to Canada because Canada is so LGBTQ friendly. Canada is so LGBT positive. This is where I want to do. Fertility clinics will understand us. Health systems will get us. It is so visible and it's a great place to live. And I want my child to have Canadian citizenship, right? Based on that. And so we have to consider that pursuing surrogacy comes with that legal climate. And that there's ambiguity in the law and changes in legislation. We see that in Canada with commercial surrogacy, right? And that ability to reimbursement. And reimbursements, I know, have been shifting and changing. And I'm sure there is still ambiguity, not living in Canada currently, but I can imagine that there's still ambiguity about what those reimbursements look like. And so not only do they have to think federally and legally, but then they also have to understand what their narrative is. So when they look for a surrogate, right, when they use those advertisements, when they go on Facebook, when they use online resources and dating apps, which is what all my gay intended parent participants called it. They called it a dating app. But when they use those, they also might find and face and be confronted with surrogates who are against gay fatherhood. So many of the participants in my study, and as well as I've read in other studies, faced surrogates who had anti-LGBT views, who didn't want to work with them because they were same-sex parents. And that heightens fears of a prolonged surrogacy journey, finding a surrogate, or a surrogate even changing her mind because she realized she doesn't want that child growing up in a same-sex parent household. And so that just adds more complexity and difficulty to that process. Now, visualizing social fatherhood. So obviously in a heterosexual parenthood, when the partner is pregnant, you go through a pre-pregnancy, during pregnancy, post-birth, you visualize social fatherhood in very different ways. And we know that in surrogacy, it's really different, right? So I'm just going to break it down into those three aspects because they are quite different in how gay men visualize social fatherhood. So in pre-pregnancy, right, there's that interactive relational processes. You're trying to establish your mutual goals. There's shared decision-making, frequent contact. There's also this closeness to a surrogate's family. So many gay men talked about how they're not close to their own family, how either they have been maybe not excommunicated, but socially isolated from family, from friends, and they want this closeness to a surrogate's family and to her spouse and her children, because that brings them together and that joins them. And so really pre-pregnancy is about those joint values of parenting, family, and children. And so for gay men in particular, it was a surrogate's ability to visualize and see them as fathers and respect them as fathers and know they are going to do a good job, and putting trust in them that they are going to be good parents and don't care about, LGBTQ issues or worries or concerns around stigma and discrimination. That trust and confidence really kind of was such an important role for them. During pregnancy, that bond through shared videos and photos, and we see this both in different gendered relationships as well as same-sex relationships in surrogacy, right? But those bonds through shared videos and photos, participating in appointments and ultrasounds. What was really interesting was they included in group messages. So I know that intended mothers are often closer to the surrogate, and intended fathers tend to be kind of in the background, right? They kind of take a secondary relationship. But it really seemed like in this same-sex relationship, both intended parents, so both fathers, were involved in group messages. Almost the three of them were bonded and united as one. And that helped to navigate their role as future parents, and for the surrogate to really allocate reproductive decision-making to her, to the surrogate, to the intended parents. Please hold on one second. My baby is crying, which I'm sure all of you can hear. So I'm going to take a quick pause, go grab him, and come back, and it'll be more exciting because I will have an actual baby.
That's no problem, Sophia. To everyone online, just stay with us for a minute or so. We'll just let Sophia grab her baby, and she'll be right back. Just a reminder to those of you watching through YouTube, if you have any questions, you can enter them in the YouTube chat. And if you'd like to send your questions anonymously, you can send them to Lori Balchuk, and her email, I think she's listed in the comments below the YouTube video. And they're so cute, Sophia. Who's that?
Hello. Hi, everybody. This is my 6-month-old Raphael, who is so cute. Sick today with a fever. So I appreciate everybody's flexibility. And this is, I guess, how working people do it these days. Thank goodness for Zoom.
It's all good.
I know. I really appreciate everybody who's online, everybody's flexibility. And it is, I guess, ironic's the wrong word to talk about surrogacy and family structures with a baby in your arms, but this is just what it is. So as I was talking about the allocating reproductive decision-making, I think one of the things that really stood out in some of the studies that I've looked at in my own study were when adverse pregnancy events would happen. So if a surrogate was going through a really tough time in terms of having either health or mental health difficulties throughout her pregnancy, what sometimes would happen was she would decrease contact. She would stop reaching out to the intended parents as much. She wouldn't want to tell them everything that was going on, and she would almost feel like a burden. And that would result in a lot of intended parents having this anxiety, frustration, the loss of control. Now, something in same-sex parents, especially with gay men, was this construct of silencing of the self. And many of you may not know what this is, but it's this notion that women often wind up silencing themselves instead of reverting to conflict or talking about their actual feelings or anger or resentment or hurt in order to avoid conflict. Right? So they wind up silencing themselves because they don't want to disrupt any harmony within a relationship. And so this was really seen kind of throughout a lot of the studies that I looked at, as well as my own. And I started thinking about these, patriarchal hierarchies where, gay men have faced obviously a lot of marginalization and vulnerability, but these these notions of women identities and men identities and what that kind of looks at when there's adverse pregnancy events. And what men would kind of talk about is this notion of not knowing how to connect or talk to the surrogate, right? So that they would say, I'm trying to navigate helping her and, making sure she's okay, but also not infringing on her bodily autonomy. And I think the same can be said in heterosexual or different gendered relationships. But I think one of the things that is really critical here is that these are two men. And so there's this notion of not really understanding what she's going through, right? That disassociation or separation from a pregnancy, from her body, right? And so there's that aspect too that would play a part and sort of disrupt that ability to visualize fatherhood, because the gay men would become very sort of concerned that this wouldn't happen, which goes back to the previous slide of this prolonged surrogacy journey. And then post-birth, that visualization. So we've seen this in a lot of surrogacy studies. We've seen this again, right? It extends the family unit in a lot of ways, but obviously in very different ways. And research across the world, it's shown the surrogate can be a close relative, right? Akin to an aunt or a grandma, right? A distant friend or acquaintance. And some had no contact. I had folks who called it a project, and they were managing a project throughout it and did not have any contact with the surrogate post-birth. But many of these individuals have to balance their child's birth story with the ability of wanting decreased contact so they can be with their own family. And for gay men who are so, I would say in some ways, removed from pregnancy and, conception and those type of ideas, many of them wanted to seek advice. Many of them relied on a surrogate's breast milk. And the surrogate wanted to offer guidance and expertise, wanted to be a sounding board to these individuals. And so what that boundary had to look like was offering advice, offering expertise, but not doubting the gay men's ability to be fathers and to be parents in their own mind. And there's this notion of sort of this degendering of parenthood, right? This degendering of fatherhood, of saying it's not a mother's responsibility, it's not a woman's responsibility anymore. These men can handle it, right? Men can be in charge. And so sometimes what would happen too is that the guidance and expertise would then disrupt sort of the men's ability to visualize fatherhood, because they would see and notice that they would not be trusted, right? Which goes back to that pre-pregnancy ideas of trust. And so sometimes also what would happen is that they would still then need to work together because of delays in legal parenting status, right? Limited accessible resources, the forms that would need to be signed. We all know that about surrogacy, but what we don't know also is all that documentation uses really heteronormative language. Birth orders use really heteronormative language. And so many gay men have to not only then get everything signed by the surrogate in order to legally leave the hospital, but they have to figure out how to sign forms that do not have two fathers listed on the form. And so that became really complicated as well, which led to a lot of delays post-birth. And so that's a little bit about visualizing social fatherhood. And so then they'd become fathers, but there was still that reliance on the surrogate, even after birth, until everything kind of got resolved, I would say. And then the last one is procreative transitioning. And this is my own term, because what I thought about procreative responsibility was really those post-birth experiences, like when you're still in the hospital and deciding how to take a baby home, right? Or whether to formula feed or breastfeed, or how to swaddle them properly. But for gay men, there are long-standing individual and institutional barriers that continue to impact their transition to fatherhood, years post-birth. And this may arise in months or years. And so post-birth is not just an immediate post-birth reaction and response, but the procreative transitioning process can take a lifetime for many gay fathers. And I broke this down into a few different constructs just to let you understand sort of what I mean, and based on research. So obviously there's domestic labor and parenting support. So in same-sex parent households, research has shown time and time again that there's an equitable division of labor, right? It's distributed often more by personal interest rather than normative gender roles. And many gay men talk about how work becomes less important, right? That financial burden becomes less important. They want to spend time at home with their child. But there's also a shortage of resources. Parenting groups are primarily for different gendered parents, primarily for moms, right? So there's maternity leave, there's mommy and me groups. There's not a lot of parenting groups and parenting resources for same-sex male parents. Formula feeding consultations, many men talk about how hospitals, now I think it's shifted a little bit, but they have talked about how hospitals are sometimes hesitant or resistant to provide formula feeding consultations or even to give formula. Some of the men in my study spoke about how they had to run to like a Shoppers to get extra formula because the hospital didn't have enough for them, because they wanted to either use donor milk or asked if the surrogate would breastfeed or certain things like that, which they did not want. And then some people talked also about first aid courses. And obviously, you know, there doesn't have to be, and I say this facetiously and like intentionally, is like, there doesn't have to be like a gay first aid course, but going to a first aid course for babies and seeing all opposite sex parents there, or seeing primarily moms there, provides this isolation and exclusion and difference and othering that gay fathers often talk about, instead of those safe spaces that they can be parents in. And so that lack or that shortage of LGBT resources specifically really is a barrier to that transition to fatherhood well after a child is born. Encounters with homophobia, right? So isolation and segregation from other gay parents, oftentimes they would talk about. They would talk about losing or lessening their friendships with other gay men. So gay men who thought that they would be following or mimicking traditional family structures, who said, oh, you just want kids, you just want to be straight. And I don't say that jokingly, I say that this is actually what gay fathers have talked about, is that lessening friendships with other gay men who were single or didn't have children. Daily microaggressions they would face, so being at the park and saying you're giving mom the day off, or babysitting I see, which I know a lot of straight fathers hear about too, but gay men would hear about it more and more, and whether or not to use that as teachable moments. So maybe a heterosexual father could laugh it off, but gay men would wonder whether that needs to be a teachable moment to that person, or even to their child if it's age appropriate, and what that looks like. So it becomes even more complex. Then they would start worrying about the child's emotional and psychological well-being, right? So school-based bullying and victimization, inquisitive questions from friends and classmates and teachers. And this creates much more work and investment for gay fathers. So not only do they have to advocate at schools on behalf of their children, they have to initiate direct conversations with school staff. They have to endorse or advocate for inclusive curricula if they're being left out of the curricula. We think a lot about how LGBTQ plus parenting and parent families, sex education is talked about in schools. Extensive research on welcoming and inclusive spaces, inclusive schools, GSAs, those type of things. And then the continuous sort of burden of having to educate teachers and staff in terms of doing that. And that is something that is lifelong and a lifelong process while their children are in school, especially when the children are young. Then those inquisitive questions, right, come age-appropriate conversations around how they were born and surrogacy. Research has shown that gay fathers tend to have earlier conversations about surrogacy with their children than heterosexual parents. They're unable to conceal or hide their children's birth story, but there's also more questions that come up from friends, from teachers, from staff at school. Then on top of that, they have to query about partial disclosure. And what I mean by partial disclosure is how much to say, right? When do I introduce the surrogate? How do I talk about surrogacy? And then how do I talk about biological paternity? So many of you who are watching this, I assume, know a lot about surrogacy, but obviously for gay fathers, they can implant one embryo where it's one sperm from one of the men, or they can implant two with two embryos, one being genetically related to one father and the other being genetically related to the other, where many often have twins, where each twin is genetically related to one of the fathers. And so sometimes when it would be one, there'd be many questions from folks being like, and who are you related to? Which one's your real father? And those type of questions. And so when those type of questions are faced in the schoolyard or in public, They have to wonder how to disclose biological paternity, especially if they don't wish to disclose it to others, right? So some men actually intentionally conceal that disclosure of paternity because they don't want that to shift the relationship either with the child or shift other people's relationships of them with their child. So that perception of, oh, he's the real dad, he has a closer relationship with them. And so that would be constantly on their mind as well. And then the last of procreative transitioning is the coming out experience, right? So we think gay men, you come out once. Coming out is a process. It's a lifelong process for LGBTQ plus folks based on implicit heteronormative biases and stigma and the continuous need to clarify your family structure and explain the child-parent relationship. We see this in administrative forms, enrollment forms, for summer camps, school, healthcare system, pediatricians, right? So if you think about everything that if you have children, everything your child does, right? A camp, an extracurricular activity, school, staying late, a field trip form, this, picking up from daycare, who's doing this, who is this person? You have to come out at every single moment that you need to fill out a new form or you need to fill out something different. And that has increased health and mental health risks for gay men and gay fathers in particular. And so what are the implications as I wrap up? I'm noticing the time. I want to leave time for questions. It means that we really need to start looking at the resilience of gay fathers, but at gay fatherhood in particular, and the nuances around their lived experiences. Because if we use heteronormative language, if we use heteronormative research designs, I believe we're going to get stuck in that no differences research, in that comparison research. And really, ultimately, the experiences of gay fathers is different. And that's okay. But we need to look at that, because by saying that there's no differences says that, okay, they're the same. Meaning we shouldn't understand those nuances. We shouldn't understand those values and attitudes and beliefs, that individuality of those experiences. So we need family scholars who have LGBT competencies. We need to have community-based research skill building where we create these research designs within and across the communities that we are serving. Because oftentimes what winds up happening is, I'm not saying that the research is biased, but gay fathers often feel like they're being questioned and interrogated, and they feel like they have to justify their parenting quality in these research studies. And we need to focus on the resilience of gay fathers and separate body, pregnancy, and birth from one another. And so what I want to leave you with is gay fathers uphold strong attachments to their children. That's what research has shown, while navigating pervasive heteronormative and homonegative contexts. And so we need to focus on the resilience of gay fathers and the resilience of their strong and stable attachments with their children beyond no differences. And so with that, this is a comic strip that relays in homonegative toxic masculinity that I wanted to leave you with. Thank you so much for being patient, and I open it up to questions. There's my email if you want to email me directly, but thank you so much, everybody.
Thanks so much, Sophia. And Raphael, thank you to you too. He did a really great job hanging in there. I know he's not feeling well. So that definitely gave us lots to think about. So thank you so much for your presentation. I'm still thinking of all the ways that it's so important to move away from sort of the heteronormative research and or assumptions, and then the real and meaningful theoretical and practical gains you can make from making such a shift. So I'm excited to continue to hear more about your work and your research in this area. Really great stuff. I know Lori's there in the background. She's keeping an eye on our chat. So I'm going to remind those of you that are watching on YouTube, if you have any questions, you can enter them in the YouTube chat. And if you'd prefer to ask a question anonymously, you can send them to lori.bulchuk@utoronto.ca. And I think that information is already in the chat. I'll also add, in terms of the questions, if you'd like to make comments, any feedback for Sophia, that's great. We will prioritize the questions if we have lots in this discussion period, but we'll make sure that Sophia gets anything that is sent to the chat or to Lori. I'm going to pull up, bear with me, Sophia, I'm going to pull up the questions here. So I don't see any questions yet. Oh, Lori's just typing one in. Thanks. All right. So maybe you could just tell us a little bit more about next steps. So with the presented sort of a theory, a different way of looking at gay parenting and surrogacy, and sort of what do you think are the next steps in terms of your research? I'm curious if you could say a little bit more about how sort of this theory and shift in thinking might also apply in other types of family building contexts for gay men in particular.
I was trying to unmute myself while he was pushing the computer. I think that's a really good question, and one that I struggle with in terms of, okay, I've done some research. I created this kind of very specific process-based, theoretical approach or framework, and sort of, well, what do I do with this, right? And I think one is to really start navigating. I think that there's a lot of research being done across the globe, but very sort of independently, I would say. I think that a lot of folks do know what's going on around and chat with each other, right? Like there's a surrogacy research group on Facebook and stuff like that. So I think that there's a community, but I don't necessarily see us all collaborating together in terms of looking at what's going on. So I think one of those things would be, really unique in terms of looking globally at what gay men are saying about their transition to fatherhood and looking at it, from a worldwide perspective, especially in relation to the different legislation and, legal rights that are happening with not only with LGBT parenting, but also with surrogacy. I think another really interesting aspect too, in terms of taking this further, is really kind of almost, because this framework is important, but a lot of people could say, I think a big argument with this is, well, how's this different than, other couples using surrogacy, right? And I've tried to lay that out here, but I think one of the things is really sort of the last thing that I kind of mentioned in terms of, separating that body, pregnancy, birth. And I think that there's a lot to say there that I'm still trying to wrestle with in terms of what does that mean, right? Like that gay fathers are separated from that pregnancy. And is that something important? Is that not? What does that mean for their bodies and their, not necessarily attachment, but what does that look like for not only childbirth, but also raising children? And I think that there's something there to talk more about the diversity of family structure that goes beyond just LGBT parenting, right?
Thanks so much, Sophia. So we have a question from Donald Ainsley. He says, thanks for the interesting presentation. He's wondering about what seems to be a working assumption that gay fatherhood involves couples. What about single gay fathers?
That's a really, really great question. So a lot of the research out there, and my research was specifically on gay partners pursuing surrogacy. That is kind of the majority, I would say, but there are single gay men pursuing surrogacy. I would say less so, but I do think that that's a really interesting avenue to look at. I think there needs to be more research done in that field. I have seen, but similarly to the no differences, I have seen research that looks at single gay men and then just single men trying to raise children. And I also think that that's problematic in and of itself to also look at that. But I think you raise a really good point. I'm so sorry. I think you raise a really good point that it is an avenue that's not looked about. And in terms of when I talk about, body and children and things like that, men's involvement in childcare, this is a much deeper conversation about men in childcare, right? And men's involvement in reproduction and procreation that we really have to continue to talk about as we talk about these type of things. Because you can think about, single gay men and gay partners, but then you can also think about LGBTQIA plus identities across the spectrum, right? And we talk about trans men where there's not a lot of research done on trans men. And so thinking about that and thinking about what that would mean is a really important avenue, because really what I'm centering on is gay partners.
Thanks, Sophia. So we have one more question. Are you okay for one more question?
Yeah, I'm okay.
Yeah, okay. So we will do one more question, and
then
we can it's all good, and then we can let Raphael get some cuddles there, poor guy. So thanks for sticking with us. So the last thing, this is something I'm wondering, is that the idea of co-creative transitioning I think I'm curious as to whether you think how it might apply to other contexts, right? So for other kinds of parents, and I'm thinking specifically about COVID and maybe the way a lot of parents had to transition or retransition and figure things out differently because the context around them changed, their social context. So do you think that the sort of term that you presented and theory around that can apply to other contexts or not? Can you say more about that?
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. It's not something that I really thought about. And then when you mentioned procreative transitioning, I thought about like cross-border or interracial adoption, right? And the questions that parents get who have, a child that's a different race than them, and those types of, the microaggressions, the looks that they get, those type of things, and how that procreative transitioning also has a lot of different experiences and difficulties and hurdles, similarly to what I just mentioned. And I do also think that COVID has created a lot of differences in terms of how we parent, who we're parenting, who's raising our children, and those type of things. So I actually, I made it and as a coining term because I thought it really connected to gay fathers. But as you say that, I'm like, this is a much actually larger term that I think could be applicable to a lot of diverse family structures, especially during COVID. So yeah, I don't really have a more in-depth answer because I'm like, yes, that's actually a really good idea.
No, that's great. And we're going to credit Raphael for that idea
Okay.
too, because I think, as I was just sort of watching you juggle everything, and I'm just in complete awe and so impressed at your professionalism and sort of ability to stick through it. So no, it is, because you got through all those slides, and I think you've done a fantastic job presenting and answering the question and sharing your ideas. All well, I know you have sort of the pressure of a baby in the background. So congratulations on that.
Thank you.
Yeah, but I was just thinking, there's lots of ways that all the parenting that people do is out on the forefront now. It's out on Zoom, and there are sort of different kinds of relationships and expectations and things that have come out of that. So I was thinking about your concept of procreative transitioning and wondering, what you thought. So I look forward to the next papers to come on procreative transitioning.
Yeah, I think that's actually, that is a fascinating thing. And I think something that we do have to think about with not only with the pandemic, but as we talk about individual life events. So thinking about life events and how we have to be flexible in terms of our transition and our procreative transitioning in terms of what we thought it would be like having kids and then what it actually is like. And then when things hit like a worldwide pandemic or,
right.
Yeah.
Right. So Sophia, we've got no problem. We've got 2 questions just came in, and we've got some steam left in you. You're good? Okay.
Yeah.
So Don would like to know if you can say anything about surrogacy as a first choice for gay men, as opposed to straight couples who he assumes typically turn to surrogacy in the face of infertility or genetic challenges.
Sorry, can you repeat that?
So if you have anything to say about sort of the difference where gay men, you've sort of reported, they turn to surrogacy as a first choice often, as opposed to straight couples, heterosexual couples, who typically turn to surrogacy as a backup plan or a second choice after they've faced infertility or they might have some genetic challenges.
Right. I think that's a really good point. So something that I brought up sort of right at the beginning was how these theoretical frameworks or these, constructs that build around the surrogacy conversation, let's say, and surrogacy research are framed in like grief, loss, life crisis, coping, marital dissatisfaction, health and mental health, and then the jealousy of the intended mother, all these type of, dialogue and conversations. And gay men in the research that I've done and the research that I've read don't have that. They have that it's a first resort, right? It's an opportunity. It's a excitement. It's an adventure. It's the chance to have a child they never thought was possible before. I remember speaking to, a couple of gay fathers, and their eyes lit up, and they were like, and then I heard about surrogacy, and I was like, what? We can do that, right? So it's that excitement and awe, and that's why surrogacy is often seen as like more guaranteed than I would say heterosexual couples who have faced so much infertility, genetic complications, loss, and things not working out. I think they go through the surrogacy journey probably with a lot more skepticism and fear than gay men who are just so thankful and gracious for this woman.
That's great. Thanks so much, Sophia.
Of course.
So our last question, and we'll do one more question and then we'll wrap it up, is
Please feel free if you have other questions to email me always.
Okay. And I see some comments are coming in too, so we'll make sure that Sophia gets to see all the questions and all the comments. So the last question is from Christy Sirota, and she says she's interested to hear more about your qualitative research methods. You speak a lot about body. I wonder if you used embodiment theory as part of your research theory and methodology.
It's a great question. I'm glad you weren't on my dissertation defense. No. I'm actually using body a lot more now because I've thought about it a lot more. So with my dissertation and with this work that I previously done, I did IPA, so interpretive phenomenological analysis. So I really grounded it in phenomenology and Heideggerian kind of concepts and thoughts in terms of, person and environment, person and context, and those type of things in order to really situate it within the socio-historical context. And so I did that, and then I based it and rooted in kind of three different aspects. I used queer theory, I used feminist relational theory to really talk about, that's where kind of the silencing of the self and the relationship between surrogates and men, and that sort of came into play in terms of bodily autonomy and a little bit about body in there. And then I sort of used the principles of biomedical ethics to frame some of my thinking around autonomy and beneficence and justice, around those type of concepts as they related to surrogacy and LGBT parenting. But I'm going to look up embodiment theory, and I think that's really interesting, but I didn't use that for this work.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Sophia. So it's time to draw today's seminar to a close. I just have a couple announcements to make before we thank Sophia. So first, our next seminar will take place on Wednesday, November 3rd. Jay Shaw and Joseph Donia will be discussing ethics and values in design, a structured review and theoretical critique. To sign up to receive our weekly seminar reminder emails, please send an email to jcb.info@utoronto.ca. And for the CSB students who are enrolled in the CSB student seminar course, please remember to keep track of your attendance. And last but certainly not least, Sophia, on behalf of all of us today, thank you so much for your presentation and for sticking through it. And we hope Raphael feels better soon. You did a fantastic job. I'm looking forward to seeing more of your work as we go forward. Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.